So one of the ideas that got me interested in theoretical neuroscience in the first place was this idea or framework promulgated by Christian Schnoy and David Cicillo and others of computation through neural population dynamics. The idea being that computations in the brain are implemented by emergent dynamical systems in large recurrent neural circuits. And indeed, this kind of general idea is very influential. And when we think about computation in neural circuits these days, we typically think about the computation as being implemented by the dynamics of neurons, the coordinated dynamics of many neurons. And the role of the synaptic connectivity, which I'm calling a JIJ in this picture, is to sculpt the neuronal dynamics to do some interesting computation of interest. Of course, there's something wrong with this picture, which is that in reality, synapses are plastic. They change on a variety of timescales, including potentially fast timescales that are not easily separable from the timescales of neuronal dynamics. And thus, it's possible that a more accurate picture of computation in neural circuits could be through the combined dynamics of neurons and synapses. And so exploring this viewpoint is the point of this talk. So zooming out, when we think about learning or plasticity and or changes more generally in neural circuits, there's kind of three timescales that we should be thinking about. So at the outermost level, there's evolution, which iterates the level of organisms. And then within the lifetime of an organism, there's what you might call slow waits, which would be synaptic weight changes that would occur on timescales of hours, days, years, etc. But then it's known that there's also faster synaptic dynamics, which I'll refer to as fast weights, which would occur at a faster time scale, kind of on a par with what neurons are doing, maybe seconds or minutes or something. So this kind of fast weight idea is the point of this talk. And there's an important aspect of this, which is that because the plasticity that I'm going to be imagining for the fast weights is activity dependent, and the activity depends on the slow weights, there's a tight link between the slow weights and the fast weights. And I should just say that in this talk, I'm not going to be considering this outermost level of evolution. And for the within lifetime weights, rather than postulating some kind of elaborate structure like we know must be present in neural circuits, I'm just going to do a much simpler thing of assuming that they're fixed and random. But nevertheless, you'll see that this tight link between the slow weights and the fast weights is crucial to the computations that I'm going to describe. Okay, so with that, let me concretely introduce the model of neuronal synaptic dynamics that I'm going to study throughout the course of this talk. So for neuronal dynamics, I'm going to use kind of a standard rate-based recurrent neural network. So here I'm specifying the dynamics of the ith neuron. The x's are like the pre-activations, the phi's are like the activations. You can think of these as like the input currents to the neuron and the firing rate of the neuron or something. So this minus x is a decay term. And so in the absence of any input from other neurons, it would just decay to zero. Of course, it does not decay to zero because it receives input from other neurons. Those inputs are received through these synaptic weights that I'm calling wij. And crucially, this is a nonlinear recurrent neural network. And so the input is through this nonlinearly transformed version of the inputs, which I'll call phi, which is just some pointwise nonlinearity. But I'm also calling phi applied to the input. And I'll typically take this nonlinearity to be a tanh. Okay, so you'll notice that I've suggestively written the weights as being time dependent. And this is because I want to consider changing weights that change in response to neuronal activity. And so in particular, I'll decompose this weight matrix into a slow term, which is actually infinitely slow. So it's just static, and this fast term. So for the static weights or the slow weights, I'll just take them to be kind of the usual IID random thing with mean zero and variance g squared over n, where g is some parameter that sets the width of the distribution of synaptic weights. And so clearly the magic is in the fast weights, this A term. And what I should specify are some synaptic dynamics for this A matrix. And what I'll assume is a Hebbian plasticity. So I have some plasticity forgetting timescale called P. Really, P is the ratio of the forgetting timescales of synapses to neurons, because I've just set the neuronal time constant to a dimensionless quantity, namely 1. And so I have a decay. And then the plasticity is driven by this Hebbian term. It's the pre times post classic Hebbian thing. So it's phi j is the presynaptic activity, phi I is the postsynaptic activity. And K is a parameter that sets both the sign and the strength of the synaptic plasticity. So positive K would be Hebbian plasticity, negative K would be anti-Hebbian plasticity. And so, the neuronal dynamics describe how the synapses shape the neurons, and then the synapse dynamics describe how the neurons shape the synapses. And there are three relevant parameters here. G, which again is the strength of the random weights, K, which is the sign and strength of synaptic plasticity of the fast weights, and P, which is the plasticity forgetting time scale. So the degrees of freedom, the full set of degrees of freedom of the system are the n neuronal variables and the n squared synaptic variables. It's a dynamical system with n plus n squared degrees of freedom. And the goal is to take n to be large, so there's a lot of neurons, and to study what the circuit does. And it turned out that there's a typical behavior in this kind of a system that's at large n is controlled by these three parameters. And there's something I wrote about in this paper with Larry Abbott. Okay, so what does this do? So in the non-plastic case, this is a classic model of Sopolinsky, and Summers. And so the non-plastic case corresponds to setting K to 0. And in this case, the phase diagram just depends on this parameter G. And it's very simple in that when G is less than some critical value given by this, the network is quiescent. So in the system, there's some trivial fixed point where all the neurons are just 0. And this trivial fixed point is stable when G is less than this critical value. And this can be seen very easily from random matrix theory. When G is greater than this critical value, the system has a chaotic state. And this chaotic state looks like this. So neurons kind of wiggle around in a seemingly unstructured, but actually quite highly structured way. And this state is interesting from the perspective of the brain because it's a dynamical state driven purely by the internal nonlinear recurrent dynamics of the system. So often when you see wiggles like this, it's because the system is being driven by some external input, but this is a extremely rich dynamical state driven purely internally, recurrently. So how do you see this? Well, there's a well-known technique called dynamical mean field theory, or DMFT, and the DMFT for this model was provided by Sopolinsky and colleagues in the late 80s, and it allows you to compute various things, such as the autocorrelation function of individual units. So this is the non-plastic case for the system. So what happens in the plastic case? So let's turn on plasticity. Here I'm setting K greater than 0, so this would be Hebbian plasticity, but in general, we'd like to know what happens for K not equal to 0. It could be Hebbian or anti-Hebbian. And what happens is that for appropriate values of G, K, and P, there are joint neuronal-synaptic dynamic states. And in fact, they're chaotic states. So what I'm showing on the left here is the activity traces of two neurons, I and J, that are fluctuating around. But also the pair of synapses that reciprocally connect these neurons are also fluctuating around, and the synapses fluctuate around these baseline values, which are shown in the dashed lines, and they're given by the static weight matrix Jij, the so-called slow weights. Okay, so these were just some parameters that I picked, and of course, what we'd like to know is systematically how does the behavior of this neuronal synaptic system depend on the system parameters, and to do that we can do the dynamical mean field theory for the system. So it turns out that a nice way to see what the kind of dynamical mean field description is involves a relationship to the attention mechanism, which is the heart of transformers. So in other words, there's a connection between ongoing Hebbian dynamics of synapses and the attention mechanism. And that was explained in this paper. And there are a variety of papers from Schmidhuber and Hinton and others that have explicated this idea. So let me write the network dynamics like this, where I've just replaced the time-dependent weights W, where I've broken that up into the contribution from J and the contribution from A. Now, remember the A dynamics obey that simple differential equation, then I can integrate and I get this term. So it's basically a exponentially filtered version of this Hebbian nerve product. So you'll note that I now have a sum of J from 1 through n and a 1 over n, so I can rearrange things. And when I get in the square bracket is basically the 2-point correlation function averaged across neurons in the network. And you can what this full integral is providing is we just go back. What this full integral is providing is a self-coupling of the ith neuron to itself. It's a nonlinear self-coupling because I have a phi within this integral, and importantly, the kind of kernel of the self-coupling is given by the 2-point correlation function of the network averaged across all of the neurons. The interesting thing is that this has a attention interpretation. So in other words, I can regard this phi j as a query at time t, or sorry, that's the phi I. This phi j is a key at time t prime, and then this is a value at time t prime. So in other words, I'm weighting contributions from abstract activity vectors visited by the network, weighted by inner products between the current activity and the activity at the past time. And this kind of thing of weighting activity vectors using weights given by inner products between other activity vectors is exactly the attention idea. Okay, but anyways, if you imagine taking the large n limit, then this empirical two-point correlation function will converge to its symptotic value, and which I'll call a C phi. And what you end up with is this so-called single site picture, which is like the statistical description of a single neuron in a large network, where there's this eta term, which is like a random Gaussian input, plus this self-coupling term, where the self-coupling depends self-consistently on this autocorrelation function of the whole network. And the statistics of this input drive also depend on this autocorrelation function. So you can solve the system self-consistently to determine this correlation function, and then you can say what the network does. Okay, so basically what's happening is that we're replacing, in this mean field picture, we're replacing the Hebbian plasticity across the synapses of the network with a local self-coupling of each neuron to itself, where the self-coupling depends on the global network activity in a self-consistent way. Okay, so using that DMFT approach, you can construct a phase diagram. There's all sorts of interesting kind of phases. Notably, what the DMFT provides is this kind of single order parameter summary statistic, this single neuron correlation function. And you might like to, there's this n plus n squared degrees of freedom, and you might want to have kind of more of a high-dimensional nuanced picture of what's happening in this system. And one way to do that is with a spectral analysis. So this is a slight detour, but I think it's interesting, so let me explain this. So an object of interest is the Jacobian of the system, evaluated at some instant on a chaotic trajectory. So when the network is just wiggling around, you can compute this instantaneous Jacobian. And so there's a neuron by neuron piece, a synapse by synapse piece, and then these off-block diagonals that tell you about the kind of local linear interaction between neurons and synapses. And so we can analyze this with random matrix theory, which I'll show you. So the Jacobian captures the kind of local linear behavior. You can also study the kind of global nonlinear behavior by numerically computing the y-beta spectrum, which I'll briefly show you. But let me talk about the Jacobian. So it turns out that, so remember there's n neurons and n squared synapses. And so in principle, in fact, in reality, this joint Jacobian has n plus n squared eigenvalues. It turns out that n squared minus n of those, let me just pull this up. It turns out that n squared minus n of those eigenvalues are purely relaxational synaptic modes that just relax with time scale -1/p. And particularly, these are modes that do not instantaneously receive, these are synaptic modes that do not instantaneously receive input from neurons. And so the remaining 2n eigenvalues are the non-trivial ones, which correspond to the interaction of the n neurons in the n-dimensional subspace of synaptic space that receives instantaneous input from the neurons. And so what I'm showing in these plots is the spectrum of this neuronal-synaptic Jacobian in the complex plane, where this red dot corresponds to is at -1/p and corresponds to the purely relaxational synaptic modes. And then the rest of the dots correspond to the non-trivial neuronal synaptic modes, of which there are 2n. And you can compute the boundary curve of this non-trivial part of the spectrum from random matrix theory. And the dots show just a finite size example of this. And what the color of the dots is not like the density or something, but rather a measure of how neuronal versus synaptic the corresponding eigenvector of the neuronal synaptic Jacobian is. So in particular, if it's totally blue, then it means it's a purely neuronal mode. And if it's totally red, then it means it's a purely synaptic mode. Okay, so this is the non-plastic case, in which case you get this circular Jacobian spectrum, which is what you would get in the a non-plastic network. But the interesting thing is that as you crank up plasticity, the spectrum changes its shape dramatically. So first, this delta function of synaptic modes kind of there's some kind of a repulsion effect by which it creates a hole to its left. So there's a hole in the spectrum. And then as you increase the plasticity further, there's a topological change where the spectrum splits into two parts. And the part that's driving the dynamics are these dominantly synaptic modes. So these are slow dominantly synaptic modes that are locally destabilized in the system. So this vertical dashed line is a stability line, and therefore driving the chaotic nonlinear dynamics in the system. And these this clump of modes here are dominantly neuronal and just relaxational. So it's kind of coming along for the ride. So it's interesting because when K is large, you're really in a synapse-driven dynamic state of the system. So it kind of encourages you to flip your view of the system as being synapses connected by neurons rather than neurons connected by synapses. Kind of an interesting thing to note. You can also go in the opposite direction, in which case there's again kind of an eigenvalue repulsion effect, but now it's kind of in the opposite direction. So first this delta function creates a hole to its right, and then eventually this hole opens up and you get these two dominantly imaginary modes that locally destabilize, these two lobes of dominantly imaginary modes that locally destabilize the system. And these correspond to chaotic activity with a dominant oscillatory component. And you can see this in the autocorrelation function as well. Okay, and all of this is borne out in the Lyapunov spectrum also. So you also see this topological transition in the Lyapunov spectrum, which again captures the nonlinear dynamics of the system. Okay, so that was a bit of a detour. Let me now talk about what computations these kind of joint neuronal synaptic dynamics are good for. And sorry, I was take questions, but I was told that I should not take questions until the end of the talk. So, yeah, so what is this good for? I'll give two examples. The first is something that we call freezable chaos, and the second is something that we call dynamic persistent activity. So let me start with this freezable chaos thing, which is marked by these parts of the phase diagram. Okay, so what is its effect? It's defined by the following manipulation. So let's assume that this network is in a joint neuronal synaptic chaotic state. What I'm showing here are traces of neurons. So K is larger than 0, so there's Hebbian plasticity. It has to be Hebbian for this to work. And yeah, so the neurons are wiggling around, and I'm not showing this, but also the synapses are wiggling around at the same time. So what I'm doing with this first vertical line is abruptly halting the synapses. This would be some kind of a neuromodulatory effect by which I dramatically slow down, or in this idealized scenario, completely halt synaptic dynamics. And what does that do to the resulting neuronal dynamics? What it does is it creates a fixed point of the neuronal dynamics. And the fixed point is not exactly, but very close to the activity vector of the neurons when you did this neuromodulatory manipulation. In other words, I've created a fixed point of the neuronal dynamics. It gives me a mechanism for creating a fixed point of the neuronal dynamics anywhere in phase space by doing this synaptic manipulation. And what this means is that when the system is being chaotic, at any instant, there's when the system is chaotic with the synapses being dynamic, at any instant, there's a stable fixed point of the neuronal dynamics, but it's being continuously destabilized by the synaptic dynamics. And a corollary of this is that if I halt the synaptic dynamics, then I create a fixed point. Okay, so what happens in the first dotted line, just to demonstrate that it's a stable fixed point, I can perturb the neurons and they relax back to where they were before. I can also do a more dramatic thing of clamping the neurons at 0, and they spring back to where they were before. And then at this second black dashed line, I can release the synapses, and the system returns to this joint neuronal synaptic dynamic state. Now I can do the whole thing again later on at time 300, but now when I halt the synapses, the neurons flow to a stable fixed point that's aligned with whatever the neurons were doing at this later time, rather than what they were doing the first time. Okay, so this freezable chaos thing happens when K is sufficiently large, the plasticity strength is sufficiently large. If K is not large enough, then you're in a non-freezable chaotic regime where when you halt the synapses, there's no memory of the system state preserved in the activity. Everything just fluctuates around. And there's also a intermediate regime called semi-freezable chaos where when you halt the synapses, the neurons do retain some memory of the halt time neuronal state, but it's not a stable fixed point. There's some dynamic fluctuations around it. So a cool thing about this is that once you've halted the synapses and created this stable fixed point, the neurons can have a whole life of their own during this halted synapse period. So here the neurons just flow to a stable fixed point and sit there. But if you had some external input that was driving the system, you can imagine the neurons doing some useful computation during this halted synapse period before resuming computation from the halt point. And this is basically an instantiation of an idea that Hinton and Plaut talked about some decades ago called true recursion. The idea being that a neural network could be computing something, it could save its instantaneous state in its synapses, use the neuronal dynamics to compute kind of a sub-computation, and then once it's finished that, resume computation up a level from wherever it left off. So this model is basically a instantiation of that idea. So there's some dynamical mean field analysis of this, where you can define this order parameter that gives you the overlap between two systems, two replicas of the system with the same slow weights, one of which has neuronal-synaptic dynamics for all t, and the other one has the synapses halted at t equals 0. And you can compute this, and it agrees with simulations and so on. Part of this that I want to flag that I alluded to at the beginning of the talk is that this effect relies on the interaction between the slow weights J and the fast weights A. So in particular, if you're in this neuronal synaptic dynamic state, you can do the manipulation I just showed before, namely halt the synapses. The neurons flow to a stable fixed point. And then you can do a weird manipulation, but it tells you something interesting, which is that you can shuffle the J matrix while keeping the A matrix fixed. What this does is it preserves the statistics of J and A individually, but it destroys the relationship between them. And so if J and A, if the relationship between them was not important for this effect, when you shuffle J, the network would just reorganize to a slightly different fixed point. Instead, what happens is you destroy the fixed point altogether, and the network goes to some purely neuronal chaotic state. You can then release the synapses kind of, so that the fast weights A kind of readapt to J, and then when you do this manipulation later, then you get a stable fixed point again. And then you can do the whole thing I just said again. This relationship is very important. So what happens if you can use this to do a task somehow? So this is basically a form of working memory, right? It gives you a way to hold an activity vector as a stable fixed point of memory for a prolonged period. And it'd be nice to have some kind of basic demonstration that this is actually useful. The one thing you could do is to save the state of not just the chaotic state of the system, but of a input. So for example, you can drive a network with a sine wave. This idea will appear in the second part of the talk as well. But you can drive a network with a sinusoidal input, and you can ask, can you save like the phase of the sine wave using this freezable chaos mechanism? And indeed you can. So I should say these were worked on by Tala Fakori as a grad student at Columbia. So here the network is being driven by the sinusoidal input. And then at this first line, she's halting the synapses and also turning off the input. And so the synapses flow to some stable fixed point using freezable chaos. That's aligned with the state of the neurons when you halted the synapses. And then at the second line, she's releasing the synapses and also turning back on the inputs. And what you get is basically continuity or approximate continuity across this very long time interval, which is interesting. So remember that the neurons can, like I said, have a life of their own during this halt time. So here she's again halting the neurons at this first line, but then keeping the input turned on for a while. And then at this second orange line, she's turning the input off. Neurons then flow back to a fixed point, but it's the fixed point that was saved when the synapses were halted. And as a result, you again get continuity across this long time interval, but the network is doing other stuff in between. And you can also use this to do kind of a neuroscience task. This is I'll just quickly go through this. Is an example of a delay matched sample task where you can do it using this halting the synapses kind of mechanism. Okay. So that was freezable chaos, and it gives you a way to create a stable fixed point of the neuronal dynamics anywhere in state space. But this fixed point is a static kind of memory. Another thing that might be of interest is a dynamic form of memory, which is the subject of this second idea. And we wrote about this in this preprint. And the shining star of this work is this incredible grad student, Alba Rocklu, who discovered this effect and did some really beautiful calculations about it. This is work with me and Larry on it. Okay, so let me now introduce something that I just briefly alluded to, which is input-driven plastic networks. So I have the same neuronal dynamics here. I have my familiar Wij of t time-dependent weight matrix. And I'll assume that this has the same J plus A form where A has Hebbian dynamics. But what I've introduced now is this input term that I'm calling H. And we'll take the inputs to be the following thing. So the inputs are active for t less than 0. And then at t equals 0, we turn off the inputs. That's what happens. And these inputs are, like suggested by the picture, sinusoidal. and there's some input amplitude I and some frequency f. And so each neuron has a random phase, and the phases are just, like I said, random across the neurons. So the parameters of this model now are G, K, and P, which is from the input free case. But now that we have this input, we have two other parameters, namely the input amplitude and the frequency of the inputs. So the non-plastic version of this, so if you set K to 0, you have a random network with fixed weights driven by some sinusoidal inputs. And this was studied in this beautiful work by Kanika Rajan and Larry Abbott and Chaim Stamplitsky. And the point of this is to ask what happens when we do this to a plastic network, and as well show you something quite interesting happens. Okay, so one thing that was shown in the Rajan work was that when the inputs are weak, the activity of the network remains chaotic. But if the inputs become strong enough, there's a phase transition where the network stops being chaotic and starts being entrained to the input. So the same kind of phase transition occurs here, and of course now it has some dependence on these plasticity parameters. And this black line here is showing the boundary between the chaotic and the non-chaotic states. And it has some dependence on the plasticity strength. What's really of interest to us, however, is not this suppression of chaos thing, but rather this thing called persistent oscillations, which I'll just show you very concretely, is the following. So these are neuronal traces over time. And remember, this oscillatory input is on for t less than 0. So from minus 100 to 0, there's some random phase sine waves driving each neuron. And you can see that very clearly reflected in the activity. But the interesting thing is what happens at t equals 0 when the input is turned off, which is that the neurons continue to oscillate, despite that the oscillatory input has been taken away. And this oscillatory activity is like markedly different from what you would see in just a network that had never seen this input before. The kind of endogenous chaotic activity looks very different from this activity. Basically, it's some kind of a dynamic form of memory. So just a couple of facts about this. First of all, the lifetime of this persistent oscillation is longer than any intrinsic timescale in the system. And the longest timescale in the system is the plasticity forgetting timescale, which in this example is 25. And so that this lifetime is very long. And you can show that these persistent oscillations are curtailed in time if the neuronal synaptic loop is opened. So namely, if the neurons are no longer able to drive the fast weights, then this oscillation no longer persists. So what that tells you is some kind of a self-renewing neuronal synaptic process that relies on the kind of mutual support of neurons and synapses to keep this going. It's also not universal throughout the phase diagram. So here, if you make the input even stronger, you might think that helps this effect, but it actually ruins it. So in this case, where the input's very strong, you don't get this persistent ringing effect. And I'll come back to this later. So that was the kind of basic definition of the effect, but of course, you'd like to know how it depends on the different parameters of the input, like the frequency and the amplitude. This is showing the ringing frequency as a function of the input frequency. And what you see is that at least in a restricted range of the input frequency, the ringing frequency grows with the input frequency. In other words, the autonomous dynamics of the system, after you've taken the input away, reflect the stimuli that it's previously experienced. So like I said, this is exactly a form of a dynamic memory. The autonomous system produces dynamics that are reminiscent of the things it's seen before. You can also look at how the lifetime depends on the input amplitude. And this is related to what I showed in the previous plot, which is that, so you need some strength of the input to get these oscillations going, so to get like a positive lifetime. But then as you keep cranking up the input amplitude, this effect starts to go away. What this tells you is that this effect occurs when you're in some kind of an intermediate dynamic regime, where the activity of the neurons in the system reflects a mixture of both the input h of t and the kind of slow weights that drive the activity j. Just to be clear, the thinking here is that if the inputs are really strong, then the neurons are basically just totally entrained to the inputs, and so j has no imprint on the activity. So you need the inputs to be weak enough such that the activity still reflects something about j. Um, okay, so what structure is required in this evolving connectivity for these persistent oscillations to occur? A natural thing to look at is the spectrum of this J plus A matrix at the time when the inputs are turned off, namely time equals zero. So, of course, after time equals zero, this A matrix keeps evolving. This is the self-renewing thing that I was talking about. But it's kind of a first pass. It makes sense to look at the structure of this matrix at the halt time itself, the halt time of the inputs. Um, what you see, and again, I can't convince you this from two plots, but what turns out to be the case is that persistent oscillations occur if and only if this J plus A matrix at t equals zero is complex conjugate outlier eigenvalues. And this makes sense. You need complex conjugate outliers to generate oscillations in a fixed weight system, and it makes sense that that's the requirement here as well. Now, the fact that this J plus A thing has complex outlier eigenvalues at all should be surprising. In light of the fact that J is an IID random matrix, so it has this circular bulk of eigenvalues in the complex plane, and A is a symmetric low rank matrix, so it has a finite number of real eigenvalues. And if there were no relationship between J and A, you can show that the only outliers in the sum would be real outlier eigenvalues, namely the eigenvalues of A. So basically, in this, the symmetry of A is a direct consequence of the Hebbian plasticity. So how could J plus A have complex outlier eigenvalues? It has to do something with the relationship between J and A. And of course, this is precisely the relationship that can occur because A evolves in an activity-dependent way. So you can confirm this is the case by looking at the overlap of A of zero with eigenvectors of J. And so this overlap corresponds to the color in these eigenvalue plots. Indeed, you can see that there's a substantial overlap between A and J. There's a non-trivial relationship. This explains why this ringing effect occurs in this intermediate dynamical regime, where the activity expresses both some structure due to J and some structure due to the inputs. Because the structure due to J is needed for J to imprint on A via the activity. So to get a better understanding of this A-J alignment mechanism, we can use kind of a toy model. So suppose I hand you psi, which is an eigenvector of J, it'll be complex, with some complex eigenvalue eta. And I challenge you to construct a matrix A hat, which is playing the role of A at t equals zero in the previous slide, where A hat is a symmetric low rank matrix, such that if I add A hat to J, the resulting sum of the matrices has outlier eigenvalues at a eta plus alpha, where alpha is some real number. So basically what I'd like to have happen is when I add A hat to J, I translate the eigenvalue pair corresponding to eta rightwards along the real axis. So if you think about this, you would realize that a suitable choice for A hat is a suitable choice for A hat is the following. So basically, the real part of psi dagger. So this is a real symmetric rank 2 matrix. And you can compute explicitly that the resulting outlier eigenvalues of J plus A hat are given by this, where this psi transpose psi thing, if J is a random matrix, will be much less than 1. And so the outlier eigenvalues are exactly what we wanted. So it's this eta pair translated rightwards by alpha. So this was just some kind of toy construction, but notably, you can take the inputs to the system to be proportional to this thing. So basically, an oscillatory input to the network where the phases of the sinusoidal input to each neuron are given by the eigenvector of J. So it's kind of an input that's targeted to a given mode of the J matrix. So we call this thing like a targeted input because we're targeting a particular eigenvector of the weight matrix. And you can show that if you choose the inputs like this, then the A matrix at t equals zero is approximately this A hat that we cooked up. And so this is a demonstration of this kind of a targeted ringing effect, where now you can choose some eigenvalue pair in the bulk, you can target it with this input, and you see that, so that this is a time trace, you pull out that eigenvalue pair, that generates ringing, and so you can kind of generate ringing in a selective way by targeting structure in the slow weights. Um, okay, so that was the kind of the toy model, but let's go back to the actual model with random phases across neurons. Um, it turns out that in the random phase case, with a sinusoidal input to each neuron with a random neuron-specific phase, you can approximate the A at time equals zero with a similar form, but where this capital psi, rather than being an eigenvector of J, now has this kind of a form. So it's kind of like a resolvent times this flex exponential, where theta is a vector of random phases. And so alpha now depends on the plasticity strength and input amplitude like this. And nu is some kind of a complex fudge factor that's set in some kind of a heuristic self-consistent way. So this is slightly hand-wavy, but the crucial thing about this that turns out to reproduce a lot of phenomenology is that there's a dependence of A on J, right? So J appears inside this term, and so the fast weights know about the slow weights. So once you assume this form, then you can do an exact at large n random matrix calculation, and you can compute the outlier to be this if this outlier is predicted to be greater than G, and there's no outlier if it's less than G, so inside the bulk. And like I said, this gets right a lot of the phenomenology of the system. And in particular, it predicts the non-monotonic input strength dependence in the preferred frequency bands of this persistent oscillation effect. And notably, it's actually kind of becomes an exact example of the toy model of the alignment that I showed before, in the sense that when this new fudge factor in absolute value approaches G from above, then this psi thing becomes an exact eigenvector of J. So it's really kind of identical to the toy model in this limit. Okay, so there's a really cool thing that I was not involved in, but I wanted to show because it's really cool. So there's a grad student, Christine Liu at Columbia, and Chris Mackinson's lab. And Christine in this lab studies cortical organoids, which are clumps of neural tissue derived from human stem cells, and they self-organize into interesting structures that have interesting recurrent dynamics. So it's great to do experiments with them. So what she can do is the following. She can do basically the experimental analog of the thing I just showed. So there's some organoid in a dish, and then she can inject an electrode and provide an oscillatory signal. And all the while, she can monitor the neural activity via calcium imaging. So this is showing some examples of this. So she can change the frequency of the input signal. And these traces on the left are neural activity before the input's provided. This red line shows the short period where the sinusoidal input is provided. And then the traces after the red bar are what the network does after stimulation. And basically, you can see that it has this ringing effect. There's some oscillatory content to the activity that was not present before that is present after the input is applied. So now you can, or Christine can kind of do make the plots like I was showing before of the ringing frequency versus the input frequency, and you see qualitatively the same thing. So here, as you increase the input frequency, the oscillatory or ringing frequency increases. So it has this dynamic memory kind of effect. And then actually didn't show this exact plot in the slides that I showed, but you can look at how the lifetime of the persistent oscillation depends on the input frequency. And it grows with the input frequency, which is what the model predicts. You can also do something very interesting, which is pharmacologically block NMDA receptors, which reduces synaptic plasticity in this organoid. And so what that does is it produces these dashed lines that are shown in this plot. So basically, this pharmacological manipulation reduces the lifetime. So it's like reducing K, the K parameter in the model, and it reduces the oscillations. And so we got an agreement with the model. So it's very interesting that we study this totally unstructured kind of rate-based recurrent network without Dale's law and all this other stuff, and yet kind of reproduces this experimental data. There's one quick thing that I just want to show at the end here, which is not work that I was involved in, but I think it's very interesting, so I wanted to show it. So this is work, a recent preprint from the Ganguly group at Stanford. So their idea was to take J, rather than being a unstructured random matrix, to be a Hebbian sum over memories, like in a Hopfield network. with Hebbian, like fast Hebbian weights on top of it. So it's kind of the slow Hebbian thing, which is the Hopfield construction. And then there's kind of a fast Hebbian fluctuation on top of it. So what does that do? So I showed in a recent paper that basically if you take a Hopfield network without any ongoing synaptic dynamics, just the classic static weight Hopfield network, there's supposed to be this like catastrophic forgetting phenomenon where when you put too many patterns into the network, it stops being able to retrieve things altogether. What you can show actually is that the transient dynamics of the system can still do a pretty good job at approximately retrieving memories, even when you're in this above capacity regime. So you kind of go towards a memory very quickly, but then you slowly drift away and fail to exactly retrieve it. But nothing truly catastrophic happens, I would say. But anyways, what they showed is that when you're in this above capacity regime, there's still kind of some structure in the energy landscape near the stored patterns. And if you have this ongoing Hebbian plasticity, that results in a change to the energy landscape of the system that kind of deepens the like approximate basins in the vicinity of memory, such that it's like a ball on a trampoline where like the ball is rolling down into a crevice, and as it rolls, the crevice gets deeper. And this like allows you to retrieve memories better than you could without Hebbian plasticity by kind of dynamically reshaping the energy landscape during the evolution of the network. So I thought that was a very interesting example, and I wanted to show it. Okay, so going back to this like nested loops of learning picture, an idea that's come up multiple times is this idea that the slow weights have something to do with the fast weights, and the configuration of the slow weights will have an effect on what kind of neuronal synaptic computations can occur in a circuit. And I've just been assuming very unstructured things for the literally a random matrix for the slow weights. But I think a really important question is to think about learning at this outer loop. In other words, how do you configure the slow weights such that the neuronal synaptic dynamics involving fast weights do some useful computation? So normally we optimize the slow weights so that just neuronal activity does something that we want it to do. But we should be thinking about kind of a meta learning thing of how do we optimize these weights so that the neuronal synaptic dynamics do something we'd like it to do. And I think this is an underexplored and important area, kind of a meta learning type of problem. So of course we can zoom out even further and consider evolution. And then if we solve all three loops of this, then we would have solved all of life, I guess. So that's the end. And just thank you everyone for listening. And I am very happy to be here and happy to take any questions and stick around for as long as people would like. Thanks.